Hello students, this is Dr. Smith, and as you work on peer reviewing your rough drafts of your Project 3 rhetorical analysis essays this week, I wanted to touch base and just remind everyone of the objectives and the purpose of this particular assignment. For the most part, from what I'm seeing of the rough drafts that have been submitted, most of you are on the right track. However, this is a difficult essay because oftentimes this is an essay that students haven't been exposed to before. So I just want to kind of go back over the parameters very, very briefly. And then we're going to look at an example of a rhetorical analysis as well. Within your lessons, there is a very detailed sample rhetorical analysis essay. If you look at your Project 3 assignment handout, which I have brought up here, as you scroll down, later in the essay, it does, or later in the handout, it does provide you with some examples that you can go to. So you want to be sure to do that. Also in the learning module, there should be a link as well. So with that in mind, I just want to review that a rhetorical analysis is a really important piece to understand as a college writer. In college level work, regardless of the particular career field that you might be going into, regardless of the program of study, you are going to be asked to critically examine and argue about the effectiveness of others' arguments and issues. Oftentimes it won't be simply a matter of you expressing your own points of view just yet, but your instructor may ask you to be more objective about something and step back and say, well, what do you think about how effective this other person's argument or issue is? An example of that would be, for instance, in biology class where you are maybe conducting experiments and then you're studying maybe a particular theory or set of theories that have been advanced by someone in the field of biology. There are often arguments within the scientific community or within other fields of study regarding particular concepts, issues, political aspects at hand. So there are a lot of political, social, and cultural aspects to an argument that may come into play. For that reason, you may be asked in your biology class, for instance, or in another class, to look at how one person's view of let's say Charles Darwin's theory of evolution has borne out over the years. Is it still a sustainable argument or issue? What are the different stakeholders at play who argue for or against that theory of evolution? So there are different kinds of arguments and issues that are going to be involved, and some of them involve very logical, fact-based lines of reasoning. Some of them don't always involve logical, fact-based lines of reasoning. But in academic audiences, what we tend to value and what we tend to give greater credibility to are the arguments that are based on logos or based on a logical line of reasoning where facts and examples and evidence can be brought to bear in order to prove a particular point. Well, in reading and writing and communication, when we build an argument, we also need to be critical of the resources that we bring in order to support that argument. So later in this semester, when you do build a persuasive argument based on a particular point of view that you have, you are still going to be responsible for actually arguing the credibility of what people say. So this particular analysis essay, although it may seem a little bit different from what you're used to, although it may seem a little tougher than what you're used to, it is a really critical set of lessons that we've gone through and that I've set up for you. So please make certain that you have gone through all of those lessons. Please make certain that you do check with me if you have any questions as you go along. I will be monitoring your group work and your peer review, and if you do have any questions or run into problems, let me know. As I said, most of you seem to be on the right track for the most part, but I want to make certain that everyone is on the right track and is on the track to be successful with this. So first of all, looking at your Project 3 assignment handout, note the heading, Analyzing the Arguments of Others. You are not building your own argument. You are analyzing someone else's argument. And in this particular essay, you were assigned to either choose Wangari Maathai's speech delivered to the Nobel Prize Committee, or another text speech, maybe even an advertisement or a documentary that builds a particular argument from a particular perspective and that uses ethos, pathos, logos, uses rhetorical devices such as tone, style, takes into consideration audience in the way that that person builds his or her arguments and evidence. All of those factors have to come into play. So when you choose a particular piece for rhetorical analysis, it needs to be something where the author is actually building an argument, and it needs to be meaty enough that you can look at things like audience, purpose, occasion, figurative language, metaphors, similes, descriptive language that's used, and then most especially the modes of appeal. Part of the reason why we went through the exercise this past week on analyzing advertisements in terms of ethos, pathos, and logos was to give you a little bit of practice with this. How is the author or the presenter actually trying to appeal to you from a credible point of view? Are they presenting credible information? Are they presenting facts and information that can be well supported? Or are they tending to appeal more towards pathos, such as some of the milk ads or some of the this is your brain on drugs ads, right? To what extent is the author employing a logical, sensible, credible line of appeal? Is this author building evidence from sources that are reliable? Is this evidence something that can be traceable? Can we then find others who also cite the same facts that are supportable and provable? So really what you're looking at is not whether or not you agree or disagree with that person's argument as presented, but how, why, and how effectively that author has built his or her argument. So this is a really important aspect to this. I do have some very specific questions that I have posted for you as well to help you generate ideas for getting started with this assignment. So if you feel that you have gotten a little bit lost or are getting off track with maybe building your own argument instead, pull yourself back, answer some of these questions about the author's background, about the author's purpose, about the author's style, and then really take a close look at ethos, pathos, and logos and how that is effectively or ineffectively used by the author to build his or her argument in the text that you have chosen. Now notice that I have given you some additional choices for alternative text suggestions. So if, for instance, you decide, you know what, Wangari Maathai I'm not so interested in, then these are a few choices that you have where there is enough argumentative style involved that you'll have a lot that you can talk about and evaluate. So Susan B. Anthony's Declaration of the Rights of Women, Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from Birmingham Jail. There is a documentary in Films on Demand through the library called The Dark Side of Chocolate that also uses a good strategy of ethos, pathos, and logos. Michael Moore's Sicko is a really good example of how these strategies can be used effectively and ineffectively, as well as Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, where you will see, not only some very effective use of argumentation, but then you'll also see how sometimes his political biases tend to affect the quality of his arguments. So lots of different possibilities here. So we're really working on those critical thinking skills right now, and we're really working on your objectivity, your ability to step back and really analyze an argument for these particular elements. And then from there, I want you to kind of remember the quotation from Ramage, Bean, and Johnson, which states, to analyze a text rhetorically means to determine how it works, what effect it has on readers, and how it achieves or fails to achieve its persuasiveness. So that is the focus of your thesis for this essay. So with that, I just want to draw your attention again to not only the Project 3 assignment handout, but also I want to draw your attention to the handout on ethos, pathos, and logos. The reason why I want you to go over this is because this can also give you some really good clues as to the kinds of information to look for that will help you determine the strategies that an author is using. So for example, logos. Well, how am I going to know that an author is using logos? Well, first of all, we're looking for facts. Statements of fact, information that can be proven, lines of reasoning. If someone gives an explanation as to how or why they think something is or is not true or is not accurate, then that is a line of reasoning. If they're drawing comparisons, if they are writing definitions and using definition to help explain a particular concept. For example, if we might be talking about global warming, we might define what global warming is before we go into discussion of the arguments surrounding it. If we're discussing the concept of freedom, then what does that concept mean to everyone? Does it apply with the same definition for everyone? What does it mean to be sustainable? What is sustainability? So any of those kinds of things are going to involve some sort of a logical appeal. Quotations from sources can also possibly be information that is used to build a logical line of reasoning. So if it's used to help establish a case, if it's used as an example to help prove a point, then a quotation or a statistic can be very helpful. Citations in particular from experts and authorities in a field can be very, very powerful from a logo standpoint. If we're citing from someone who is very knowledgeable in their area, then that particular person is going to have more of a logical point of view, but then also potentially there is going to be greater ethos as well, greater credibility. Examples, sometimes real life examples or personal anecdotes can also be used to build a logical line of reasoning. And then that moves into ethos. Ethos has to do with two elements, the author's background and credibility, but also the sources that the author uses. Is the author using credible sources from experts in the field? Is the author drawing upon first-hand information that is credible and provable and can be supportable and reproduced? Is that person also acknowledging an opposing view, or is that person only presenting the arguments from one side or one perspective? So for example, in the case of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, this is a really good example of how Martin Luther King Jr. actually brings up the opposing arguments of the clergyman before he even attempts to build his own argument for why and how he felt it was important at that particular point in time to be involved in the nonviolent protests during the Montgomery bus boycotts. Morally and ethically speaking, is the author morally and ethically presenting this information in a way that, again, is honestly representing the facts, honestly representing the situation. Um, so professional vocabulary and format can also be an important part of ethos as well. So how professionally is the information being presented to the author or to the audience? Pathos. Pathos is a really good example of something that politicians sometimes use in order to appeal to a given audience. The advertisements that you looked at in your exercises last week are a really good example of the use of pathos to startle or shock or to attract the attention of audience members. Usually the language is very emotionally loaded. The language involves very vivid descriptions. The examples are very emotion laden. A good example of that would be, the advertisements that we sometimes see for animals in an animal shelter and providing money to the ASPCA to prevent cruelty to animals. Oftentimes we're shown these poor forlorn faces with their eyes and their great big eyes of the cats or the dogs or the animals that are in cages and have been mistreated, and it's definitely tugging at our heartstrings. So when you think of pathos, think of that emotional appeal. Pathos often involves a lot of anecdotes, testimonies, personal narratives about personal experiences that also tie in with that. So a good example of that might be if you were reading an argument about the best possible treatment for cancer, for instance, that has come out, and the fact that it's still being studied, let's say. Then let's say that there is an emotional appeal on the part of a speaker or an author to release that particular drug from a little bit sooner, let's say, from a trial of some sort. Then they might employ a little bit of emotional appeal to talk about the urgency of the matter, or how many people might end up dying as a result of not releasing this sooner for people to try this experimental drug, for instance. Figurative language becomes a very big part of pathos because figurative language, when we build an analogy or a simile or a metaphor to help draw comparisons, then that's something that appeals to our audience in a very visceral way. Emotional tone, humor, sarcasm, disappointment, excitement. A good example of sarcasm would be Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. If you look at the context and the history of that particular argument, you'll find that this is a satirical piece where he initially starts out by suggesting one thing and then actually intends to draw attention in a very startling way to the plight of young children who are on the streets of London during that time period in history. So each one of these particular modes of appeal is probably being used in one way or another in either Wangari Maathai's speech or one of the other alternative speeches that you've been given. If there's something else you have in mind, of course you can run that by me. But at this point, since we're into the rough draft mode, hopefully you have chosen one of the required elements. But use this handout to help you identify the kinds of things that you are looking for logos, ethos, and pathos. And I think that you will find that that is very helpful. All right. Going back to that then, the next thing that I would like to do is just very briefly point out a couple of things that you can look for in an analysis essay. So we're going to continue that in my next segment.